The quiet cooling of the Pacific Ocean can unleash a storm factory in the Atlantic. That is the paradox of La Niña, the so-called little girl of the ENSO cycle. It may sound like a gentle name, but La Niña is America's hurricane alarm bell, ringing every few years to warn the Gulf Coast, Florida, and the Atlantic seaboard that the season ahead could be more violent than usual. When the tropical Pacific cools, the trade winds intensify, the atmospheric engine shifts, and the conditions that normally suppress hurricanes in the Atlantic disappear. Suddenly, the ocean east of the Caribbean becomes an open runway for tropical storms, and the United States faces seasons that test its resilience, its infrastructure, and its communities. To understand La Niña's impact, it helps to recall how hurricanes form. They are towering heat engines, spirals of warm, moist air feeding off hot ocean waters. For them to grow, the upper atmosphere must remain relatively calm, allowing the vertical structure to build uninterrupted. When winds high above the ocean tear at these systems, their organization falls apart. This wind shear is the great enemy of hurricane formation. During El Niño years, the Pacific's warming shifts atmospheric circulation in a way that increases wind shear across the Atlantic, keeping many storms from becoming monsters. But during La Niña, the opposite occurs. Wind shear is reduced, the lid is lifted, and hurricanes are free to thrive. That is why La Niña years consistently bring more storms, stronger storms, and longer seasons in the Atlantic basin. The statistics tell the story clearly. NOAA data shows that Atlantic hurricane activity increases significantly during La Niña years. Storm counts rise, and the number of Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes climbs sharply. For the United States, this translates into greater risk along the entire Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard. Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas all know that when La Niña is declared, it is time to prepare for the worst. Insurance companies take notice, emergency planners raise their alert levels, and coastal communities revisit evacuation routes. La Niña is not a guarantee of disaster, but it is a loaded dice roll that heavily tilts the odds toward more destructive storms. The 2005 hurricane season remains one of the most infamous examples. Under the influence of La Niña conditions, the Atlantic erupted with 28 named storms, 15 hurricanes, and a record 4 Category 5s. 3 names are etched into American memory: Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Katrina struck Louisiana and Mississippi in late August, breaching levees in New Orleans and drowning an American city. More than 1,800 people died and damages exceeded $160 billion. Rita followed in September, forcing one of the largest evacuations in U.S. history as it threatened Texas and Louisiana. Wilma, later that October, became the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic basin, slamming into Florida and leaving a trail of destruction across the Caribbean and the southeast of the United States. The 2005 season was so active that forecasters ran out of names and had to use the Greek alphabet, an unprecedented move at the time. That year remains a case study in how La Niña primes the Atlantic for chaos. Fast forward to 2020, another year marked by La Niña conditions, and history repeated itself on an even larger scale. The Atlantic produced 30 named storms, breaking the record set in 2005. 12 of those storms struck the U.S. mainland, the most ever recorded in a single season. Communities along the Gulf Coast were battered repeatedly, sometimes with barely enough time to recover before the next storm arrived. Louisiana alone endured 5 landfalls in one season, a cruel reminder of how vulnerable the state is under La Niña's regime. Emergency shelters overflowed, hospitals strained under both storm injuries and the COVID-19 pandemic, and billions in damages piled up across multiple states. Once again, the alphabet of storm names was exhausted, and Greek letters were needed. The 2020 season underscored the grim truth. La Niña turns the Atlantic into a conveyor belt of storms aimed at the United States. For Florida, the stakes are obvious. The peninsula juts into warm waters that act as fuel for hurricanes. When La Niña removes the atmospheric barriers, every tropical wave rolling off Africa has a higher chance of growing into a hurricane that can make landfall. From Miami to Tampa to Jacksonville, Floridians know that La Niña seasons are seasons of heightened vigilance. Emergency managers double-check evacuation plans, insurers prepare for more claims, and families stockpile supplies. Even when a season passes without a major landfall, the anxiety of watching storm after storm churn across the Atlantic leaves its mark. La Niña is a psychological as well as a physical burden for Florida. For Texas and the Gulf Coast, La Niña is equally ominous. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the most hurricane-prone bodies of water in the world. Its loop current provides warm water deep below the surface, giving storms extra fuel to intensify rapidly. In La Niña years, when atmospheric conditions are favorable, this warm pool becomes a launch pad for some of the strongest storms. Rita in 2005 and Laura in 2020 both gained strength in the Gulf, slamming into Louisiana and Texas with devastating force. Houston, Galveston, and New Orleans all sit within this danger zone, and in La Niña seasons, the odds of a direct hit rise significantly. For oil refineries, petrochemical plants, and shipping hubs along the Gulf, La Niña years threaten billions in economic losses and national energy disruptions. Why do Gulf Coast states watch for La Niña warnings every year? Because the stakes are existential. These states are not only vulnerable because of geography, but also because of economics. The Gulf Coast is home to critical energy infrastructure, agricultural production, and shipping routes. A single major hurricane can disrupt oil supplies, spike gasoline prices nationwide, and shut down global trade routes. Communities that depend on fishing, tourism, and shipping can be wiped out in a single season. With La Niña tilting the odds, governors, mayors, and emergency planners know that every warning matters. They monitor NOAA's ENSO forecasts closely, adjusting budgets, planning drills, and mobilizing resources months before the storms arrive. But beyond the science and economics, La Niña is personal. It is the mother in Louisiana who packs her children into a car as a hurricane bears down. It is the farmer in Texas who watches crops flattened by wind and rain. It is the family in Florida who huddles in a shelter, hoping their home will still be standing when they return. La Niña may begin as a cool patch of water in the Pacific, but its impact is measured in lives disrupted and lives lost in the Atlantic basin. The lesson is clear. La Niña is not just a scientific label. It is a warning system, a red flag for the Gulf Coast and the Eastern Sea. When forecasters announce La Niña, Americans know what that means. More storms, stronger storms, and greater risks. The Pacific's cooling becomes the Atlantic's fury, and the United States becomes the target. The 2005 hurricane season is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in U.S. disaster history, and it stands as a warning of what La Niña can unleash when the Atlantic is primed for destruction. That year, the ocean was hot, the wind shear was low, and the conditions were ideal for tropical storms to thrive. By the time the season ended, 28 named storms had been recorded, 15 of them hurricanes, and 7 of those major hurricanes. The season was so active that forecasters ran out of their official list of names and resorted to the Greek alphabet for the first time in history. This was not a random accident of weather. It was La Niña's signature, the unmistakable fingerprint of a Pacific cooling that allowed the Atlantic to burn with fury. Hurricane Katrina was the most infamous storm of 2005, and its story has been told in countless documentaries, books, and survivor accounts. But its significance cannot be overstated. Katrina began as a tropical depression in the Bahamas and quickly strengthened as it entered the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf's warm waters, supercharged under La Niña's favorable atmosphere, fed the storm until it became a monstrous Category 5 hurricane. Though Katrina weakened slightly before landfall, it remained catastrophic. New Orleans, sitting below sea level and protected by levees, was devastated when those levees failed. Entire neighborhoods were submerged. Thousands were stranded without food or water. More than 1,800 people died, and damages exceeded $160 billion, making Katrina the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history at that time. Katrina was not the only storm of 2005. Rita struck weeks later, targeting the Texas-Louisiana border. With winds peaking at 180 miles per hour, Rita became one of the strongest hurricanes ever recorded in the Gulf. Its approach forced one of the largest evacuations in U.S. history, with more than 3 million people fleeing inland. Highways clogged for hours, fuel shortages spread, and chaos reigned as people tried to escape the storm. Though New Orleans was spared a direct hit, the fragile city faced renewed flooding. Across Texas and Louisiana, Rita left widespread damage, adding tens of billions in losses to a season already drowning in costs. Then came Wilma, the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic basin, with a central pressure dropping to 882 millibars. Wilma tore through the Caribbean, then struck Florida with ferocious winds and rain. Millions lost power, homes were shredded, and agricultural fields were destroyed. By the end of the season, the US was exhausted, battered by three of the most destructive hurricanes in modern history. La Niña had turned the Atlantic into a relentless storm factory, and America had paid the price. 15 years later, the 2020 hurricane season set new records and reminded the nation that La Niña remains a recurring threat. The season produced 30 named storms, surpassing even 2005. 12 storms made landfall in the United States, the most ever recorded in a single season. Louisiana was hit 5 times, a punishing sequence that stretched communities and emergency resources beyond their limits. Families who had just patched roofs or cleared debris from one storm found themselves evacuating again only weeks later. One of the most devastating storms of 2020 was Hurricane Laura. Making landfall in Louisiana as a Category 4 hurricane, Laura brought catastrophic winds, storm surge, and flooding. Entire towns were flattened, power grids collapsed, and recovery took months. Just weeks later, Hurricane Delta struck the same region, piling new destruction on communities still reeling. Then Hurricane Zeta followed, compounding the misery. For Louisiana, 2020 was a nightmare of repeat trauma. Each landfall meant new evacuations, new damages, and new struggles to rebuild. Beyond Louisiana, other states were pummeled. Hurricane Sally drenched the Florida Panhandle, causing widespread flooding. Hurricane Isaias swept up the East Coast, leaving millions without power. Storm after storm tested supply chains, disrupted energy infrastructure, and forced emergency shelters to operate during the COVID-19 pandemic. Social distancing complicated evacuations. Shelters had to adapt to new safety protocols, and already stretched hospitals dealt with storm injuries on top of pandemic surges. The economic costs of 2020 were staggering. Damages in the United States exceeded $40 billion, and insurers faced a flood of claims. Farmers lost crops to flooding, wind, and saltwater intrusion. Oil refineries along the Gulf were disrupted, pushing gasoline prices higher nationwide. Supply chains faltered as ports closed and shipping was delayed. The federal government issued multiple disaster declarations, pouring billions into relief and recovery. For taxpayers, the costs piled up once again, just as they had in 2005. But beyond the statistics and dollars, the human stories of 2005 and 2020 reveal La Niña's true power. Families huddled in attics as floodwaters rose. Children clutched stuffed animals in crowded evacuation shelters. Elderly residents were stranded without power for weeks. Small businesses that had survived one storm shuttered forever after the second or third. Communities that prided themselves on resilience found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer frequency and intensity of storms. The psychological toll is harder to measure, but just as real. In Louisiana, residents speak of storm fatigue, a sense of exhaustion from living under constant threat. In Florida, families dread the approach of each new tropical wave, wondering if this one will be the storm that changes their lives. In Texas, residents of coastal cities live with the knowledge that a single La Niña-fueled hurricane could bring disaster on a scale that dwarfs previous storms. This constant anxiety is itself a cost, a weight borne by millions of Americans living in hurricane zones. Why were 2005 and 2020 so destructive? The science is clear. La Niña reduces wind shear in the Atlantic, giving hurricanes room to grow. At the same time, warm Atlantic waters, often even warmer in La Niña years, provide abundant fuel. The combination is deadly. Storms not only form more frequently, but also intensify more rapidly. Rapid intensification, where a storm gains 35 miles per hour or more in wind speed within 24 hours, has become increasingly common in recent decades. La Niña creates the atmospheric conditions that allow this rapid growth to occur, leaving communities with less time to prepare. For the Gulf Coast states, this is why La Niña warnings are taken so seriously. Governors, mayors, and emergency managers know that a La Niña season is not just another hurricane season. It is a heightened threat level. They increase readiness drills, stockpile supplies, and coordinate more closely with FEMA and federal agencies. Insurance companies adjust premiums and prepare for higher payouts. Energy companies fortify offshore rigs and coastal refineries. Every sector of society goes on alert. Yet even with preparation, La Niña seasons remain devastating. No amount of readiness can prevent levees from failing when overwhelmed, or homes from flooding when storm surge reaches their doorsteps. Preparation saves lives, but it cannot erase the destruction of property, the displacement of families, or the disruption of economies. This is why La Niña is called an alarm. It is not the disaster itself, but the signal that disaster is more likely, more frequent, and more intense. The seasons of 2005 and 2020 remind us that La Niña is not an abstract concept. It is the difference between a manageable hurricane season and one that rewrites history books. It is the line between a community that weathers a storm and one that collapses under the weight of repeated hits. It is the reason Gulf Coast states watch ENSO forecasts with such intensity, knowing that the cooling of the Pacific is a prelude to the fury of the Atlantic. As America looks to the future, the lessons of 2005 and 2020 loom large. La Niña will return as it always does, and when it does, the Atlantic will once again become a storm factory. The only questions are how strong the storms will be, where they will land, and whether we will be ready. La Niña is more than a scientific label. It is a call to arms for the Gulf Coast of the United States. From Texas to Florida, the states that line the Gulf of Mexico know better than anyone what this Pacific cooling means. When La Niña is declared, the odds of a major hurricane season rise sharply, and history has shown that the consequences can be devastating. Communities here live on the front line of America's climate risks, and their survival depends on paying close attention to the warning signs that come from half a world away. Why do Gulf Coast states watch La Niña so closely? The answer lies in geography, economics, and experience. The Gulf of Mexico is a perfect incubator for hurricanes. Its waters are deep and warm, providing endless fuel for storms. Its coastline is dotted with major cities, Houston, New Orleans, Tampa, Miami, that sit perilously close to sea level. Its shores are lined with refineries, petrochemical plants, ports, and power infrastructure that serve not just local communities, but the entire nation. When a hurricane slams into the Gulf, the damage is not just regional. It ripples outward into national energy markets, supply chains, and the federal budget. In La Niña years, when the Atlantic is primed for storm activity, the Gulf becomes ground zero for America's climate vulnerability. Texas illustrates this danger vividly. Houston, home to millions of people and the heart of America's energy industry, is one of the most hurricane-exposed cities in the world. Refineries, pipelines, and chemical plants sit within reach of storm surge. Hurricanes fueled by La Niña conditions can shut down production, disrupt supply, and cause spikes in gasoline prices nationwide. In 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall near Galveston, causing over $30 billion in damages and knocking out power for millions. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey, intensified by warm Gulf waters, stalled over Texas, dumping more than 60 inches of rain in some areas. Harvey was not a La Niña storm, but its devastation illustrated what can happen when Gulf storms find the right conditions. In a La Niña year, those conditions appear more often than Texans know. Louisiana has learned its own painful lessons. New Orleans, a city below sea level, will forever be associated with Katrina. But the state has endured repeated hits: Rita, Gustav, Laura, Delta, Ida. Each storm brings new destruction, testing levees, hospitals, and emergency systems. In 2020, 5 named storms struck Louisiana in a single season, leaving the state in a constant cycle of evacuation and recovery. The psychological toll was immense, with families barely recovering from one storm before the next arrived. For Louisiana, La Niña forecasts are not abstract science, they are survival guides. Florida faces a different but equally pressing vulnerability. Surrounded on 3 sides by water, the state is a magnet for landfalling storms. Its population has grown dramatically in recent decades, with millions moving into coastal areas that are highly exposed to storm surge and wind. Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville are are among the most at-risk cities in America. La Niña years make the state even more precarious, increasing the odds that tropical waves off Africa will strengthen into hurricanes aimed directly at the peninsula. Insurance companies already charge some of the highest premiums in the nation for Florida homeowners, and in La Niña years, the risk models grow even bleaker. Residents know that every season under La Niña is a season of heightened danger. Mississippi and Alabama, often overshadowed in national coverage, also live under this shadow. The coastline may be smaller, but the vulnerability is just as real. Gulfport, Biloxi, and Mobile have all been devastated by hurricanes in past La Niña years. These states watch ENSO forecasts with the same intensity as their larger neighbors, knowing that one storm can erase years of progress and investment. Beyond geography, the Gulf Coast watches La Niña because of the economic stakes. The region's energy infrastructure is critical to the entire country. Refineries in Texas and Louisiana produce a large share of America's gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Ports like Houston and New Orleans are vital trade hubs for grain, oil, and manufactured goods. Hurricanes disrupt all of this. In 2005, Katrina shut down refineries and caused nationwide fuel shortages. In 2020, Laura forced evacuations of oil rigs and halted shipments along the Mississippi River. When the Gulf goes offline, America feels it. That is why energy companies, shipping firms, and federal agencies monitor La Niña with such urgency. For ordinary residents, the stakes are even more personal. A La Niña season means stocking up on supplies, mapping evacuation routes, and living with the constant anxiety that the next storm could be the big one. Families build their lives around hurricane readiness, balancing the need to prepare with the hope that they will be spared. Schools run emergency drills, hospitals rehearse mass casualty scenarios, and local governments plan shelters and evacuation traffic flows. These preparations are not optional. They are the only defense against the heightened risks that La Niña brings. The 2005 and 2020 seasons made this painfully clear. In both years, Gulf Coast states were battered repeatedly, their readiness tested over and over. Each storm revealed weaknesses in levees, evacuation systems, or recovery funding. Each storm showed how difficult it is to recover when the next disaster is already forming offshore. La Niña does not just create storms, it creates clusters of storms, rapid-fire impacts that compound one another. For Gulf Coast residents, this cycle is exhausting, dangerous, and expensive. Why then is La Niña called an alarm bell? Because it is the earliest signal Americans have that the Atlantic is entering a dangerous phase. By monitoring Pacific cooling, scientists can forecast months in advance whether the hurricane season will likely be above average. These forecasts give Gulf Coast states precious time to prepare, time to strengthen levees, stockpile supplies, and warn communities. But like any alarm bell, it is only useful if people listen. When La Niña is declared, it is not just an academic statement. It is a warning to every family from Texas to Florida that the dice are loaded against them. As this third video in our ENSO series closes, the lesson is stark. El Niño may calm the Atlantic, but La Niña awakens it. La Niña turns the ocean into a breeding ground for hurricanes, testing the resilience of Gulf Coast states and threatening lives, homes, and economies. The disasters of 2005 and 2020 proved that point in tragic detail. The Gulf Coast watches La Niña not because it is interesting science, but because it is survival science. The water cooling off the coast of Peru is not distant. It is the hidden force behind boarded windows in Miami, mass evacuations in Houston, and storm surge flooding in New Orleans. It is the reason families lose power, insurers lose billions, and taxpayers cover the costs of rebuilding. La Niña is America's hurricane alarm bell. When it rings, every Gulf Coast state must answer. At Crisis Lens, we bring you these stories because awareness is the first step to resilience. Understanding La Niña means understanding why hurricanes strike harder and more often in some years, and why preparation is not optional. If you found this exploration valuable, help us spread the word. Subscribe to Crisis Lens, hit the notification bell, and share this video with friends and family who need to know what's coming. Together, we can turn warnings into action and reduce the toll of storms that will inevitably return.